Income tax 2020. Other adjustments to income. Come in, relax with income tax 2020. Other adjustments to income. When considering our income tax equation, we're going to be on line 2, remembering that we can break our income tax equation into two halves, the first half being a modified income statement, the second half then being the calculation of the tax, then application of the payments and credits to get then to the tax refund or amount due on the bottom line. We're going to be focusing in the first half, that being the modified income statement. Line 2 has many names to it here. We can call it above the line deductions as compared and contrasted to below the line deductions, which I think is fairly common and probably the easiest way to refer to them, meaning above the line deductions versus the below the line, which could be either of the standard deduction or the itemized deduction. We can also call them, of course, adjustments to income. We can call them deductions for adjusted gross income. We can call them Schedule 1 deductions. But remember, we are up here in terms of the equation when considering them. And we're going to be down here on the Form 1040. We're going to be looking then at line number 10. This 1040 is quite small here because we want to fit it on one page so you can see the full 1040. But we will go to tax software in future presentations, and it'll be a little bit more clear to see once we go to those example problems. This 10, line 10 then, will be supported by the Schedule 1 Part 2. So this is Part 2 of the Schedule 1. We're going to be focusing in on the educator expenses, the moving expenses for members of the armed forces, where we would attach Form 3903, and the tuition and fees deductions, which we would attach Form 8917. Now, all of these three sound like, important items, but really they've been severely limited or have kind of gotten old over time. And so they're not as important as you might think. Therefore, we're going to kind of group them together. These are things you're not going to see all the time. You might have questions related to them, and you might have questions related to how they used to be or something like this. And or they might just see them on these adjustments, and you might have questions about them. So one, educator expenses. Now, the educator expenses are like a deduction that was put in place for really specific industry, those being educators, typically teachers, usually like K through 12 type of instructors, to give them a deduction for expenses. And it seems to me kind of like a political type of thing. They're gonna, we're gonna have a special deduction just for one particular industry, those being teachers. But that was put on the books a while ago, and the deduction is severely limited at this point, so it's a fairly small deduction. But if you're dealing with it, if you happen to have a teacher, then you're going to think that they have the educator expenses, and you want to just make sure to basically add that in. It's usually pretty small, so oftentimes if they are a teacher, they probably qualify for it, and you probably get, they could probably qualify for the amount of the expenses. If they're a teacher, they probably spent more than that amount on education expenses because the deduction is fairly old and it hasn't really changed for a while. So that would only be applicable, if you have a teacher or whatnot in a very specific industry, then you're going to say, they might have the educator expense here that we can put in for the adjustments to income. And then we have the moving expenses. Now, the moving expenses used to be more broad, meaning they were trying to incentivize or give some people some benefits or a tax break, in other words, if they switched jobs. So if you switched jobs, then they were trying to give you like a little break there to be able to get through the point where you're between jobs, possibly, was the thought process. And therefore you'd have to qualify for how far the job was from the other job and this and that. But they removed that now for the most part, and now it's very restricted to armed forces. So now we're talking about moving expenses for members of the armed forces, where we would attach Form 3903. So again, you might get people asking you questions about moving, like, well, I moved for work. Don't I get a deduction related to that? Not right now, because they removed it basically 2 years ago, unless you moved related to armed forces. It was a move specifically to the industry or the profession of armed forces. Otherwise, they've removed that. Again, it might be back next year. All this could change basically next year. But at this point in time, the moving expenses have been removed, and they're severely limited. Now, even if someone is in the armed forces and they moved, then usually the armed forces are pretty good. Usually, in my experience, I'm not an expert at this. I don't have a lot, of tax practice clients, but from what I've seen, it looks like the armed forces is pretty good at reimbursing people for moving oftentimes. And if they're reimbursed for the move, or if they basically, the move was paid for, then they typically wouldn't get the move. So that means that the moving expenses are severely limited generally, because it's now limited to only the armed forces rather than moving for work in general, any type of new job or whatever. And the armed forces usually is fairly good at reimbursing people in some way, shape, or form for the move, and therefore it's not something that you would be deducting in that case. So I find at this point, at least from what I've seen, that line 13 is not used all that often. Again, it might change next year. You might have questions about it, but that's so you want to know so you can answer questions about it typically. Tuition and fees deduction, attached form 8917. Now this one looks really relevant, of course, because a lot of people go to school and they would have tuition and fees. But the thing with this one is that it's attached typically, or usually you would be being able to take this deduction or be able to take a credit, and there's 2 credits related to tuition and fees deductions typically for higher education, like college education type of tuition and fees. And typically the credits will be worth more than the deduction. So I find then, again, usually you don't get back to the deduction here. If someone asks about it and they have tuition and fees, you're going to say, hey, look, we're going to look first for the credit. There's 2 credits. We're going to look for the best credit you can get, then the second best credit. And if for whatever reason you don't qualify for those 2, then we're going to go down here to the tuition and fees. And that's how the hierarchy of people that are in higher education and are paying for basically college and tuition are going to try to take advantage or get a tax break for that, right? We're going to go for the credit first, the number 1 credit, then the number 2 credit. And if I don't get either of those, which is kind of not totally normal, you'd think you'd get one of those, and it's usually more beneficial than the deduction here. But if not, then we'll take the deduction here. So that's why this one is not, as relevant. So these 3 then not as relevant. They're not going to be coming up all the time, but you might have questions on them and they might be relevant from time to time. So we have the educator expenses. If you're an eligible educator, you can deduct up to $250, $500 if married, filing jointly, and both your spouses are eligible educators, but not more than $250 each of unreimbursement, trade, or business expenses. So again, very specific type of deduction. It looks like a very political deduction to me, right? They chose, the public work. They chose the teachers and said we're going to give a deduction directly to them. They did this a while ago, so the dollar amount is still fairly low. So it's 250 is a fairly low dollar amount for the deduction. Now, of course, the teachers, if you're talking about a teacher like a K through 12 teacher, for example, they probably spent more than that, almost surely from their personal expenses for equipment over 250 for a year. They want to make sure that they can support that and be able to support it if in the case of an audit or something like that. But due to the fact that it's a fairly low threshold, if you talk to someone and they say, yeah, I'm a teacher, I'm a K through 12 teacher or whatnot, then you're going to say, well, save your expenses for anything up to 250, and they probably will have enough to cover that, and you can basically add the 250 then as above the line deduction in that case. So qualified expenses for amounts you paid or incurred for participation in the professional development courses, books, supplies, computer equipment, including related software and services, other equipment, and supplementary materials that you use in the classroom. So again, all this type of stuff, many teachers, probably, you kind of get into that stuff if you're a teacher, I would think, and probably have enough to cover the 250 expense possibly. But in any case, for courses in health or physical education, the expenses for supplies must be for athletic supplies, and this deduction is for expenses paid or incurred during the tax year. So obviously it's a cash basis kind of system, meaning they must have the cash has to have gone out, they must have paid for it in the year that you want to take the deduction. So educator expenses, you're an eligible educator if for the tax year you're a kindergarten through grade 12 teacher, instructor, counselor, principal, or aide for at least 900 hours of school year in a school that provides elementary or secondary education as determined under state law. So this is the rule. Do they qualify to be an educator expense? If they do, you want to encourage them to save at least 250 of if they have that of expenses that they have incurred, and then you can basically take that above the line deduction, which is now. Next, we have moving expenses for members of the Armed Forces Form 3903. Now remember, the moving expenses prior to the change like 2 years ago, which much more broad, which would be related to basically a change of job or a change of job that required a move. Now it's going to be restricted for members of the armed forces. So that means you're going to see it a lot less often, but you might get questions about it. Again, it might change next year, but this year, this is where it is at. And even if there was a move for a client or a taxpayer who was a member of the armed forces, if they were reimbursed for it, and many times they will be if it's related to the armed forces, because the armed forces oftentimes will, then they typically won't be able to get the deduction for it either, because they were reimbursed for the expenses. So I don't see that this one is as applicable as it used to be, but you might see the circumstance and you might have questions about it based on the change that took place a couple of years ago. People might be asking, in other words, I moved and it's job related, do I get a deduction? And the general question is, well, unless you're in armed forces, that rule has kind of changed. You're probably thinking about the old rule. So in any case, moving expenses deduction eliminated except for certain armed force members. For tax years beginning after 2017, you can no longer deduct moving expenses unless you are a member of the armed forces in active duty and, due to military order, you move because of a permanent change of station. Use Form 3903 to figure your moving expense deduction if you are a member of the armed forces on active duty and, due to military order, you move because of a permanent change in station. So a permanent change in station. A permanent change of station includes a move from your home to your first post of active duty, a move from one permanent post of duty to another, and a move from your last post of duty to your home or to a nearer point in the United States. The move must occur within 1 year of ending your active duty or within the period allowed under the Joint Travel Regulations. Services or reimbursements provided by the government. So don't include in income the value of moving and storage services provided by the government because of a permanent change of station. Similarly, don't include in income amounts received as a dislocation allowance, temporary lodging expense, temporary lodging allowance, or move-in housing allowance. Now, hopefully, most of the time, the armed forces will basically take care of these situations and the moving costs and whatnot, and determine whether or not they should be taxable or not, and hopefully provide that on the documentation form reporting the income, so that you could just enter basically the reporting form like the W-2 type of form, and it will have been taken care of by basically the employer, by the government in this case. But so you want to be aware of that when you're discussing the moving expenses. Has it been reimbursed? Is it included? Is it included in the documentation reporting basically the income? And so then generally, if the total reimbursement or allowances that you receive from the government because of the move are more than your actual moving expenses, the government must include the excess in your wages on the W-2. So in other words, if you had the move and the government basically reimbursed you for them, then it shouldn't be something that's going to be included in income, because basically they're going to take care of it on the W-2 form. So instead of you putting it in as wages and then taking a moving deduction, they're basically going to remove it from line 1 of the W-2. However, if you got more in compensation, or if you got more than the cost of the move, then they're going to have to include that in income on the W-2 form, and you're going to have to pay taxes on the amount that was above the amount of the move. So however, if any reimbursement or allowance other than dislocation allowance, temporary lodging expenses, temporary lodging allowance, or move-in housing allowance exceed the cost of moving and the excess isn't included in your wage on Form W-2, the excess still must be included in gross income on Form 1040 or 1040 SR line 1 or Form 1040 NR line 8. If your reimbursement or allowances are less than your actual moving expenses, don't include the reimbursements or allowances in income. You can deduct the expenses that are more than your reimbursement in the year you paid or incurred the expenses. If you must relocate and your spouse and dependents move to or from a different location, don't include in income reimbursements, allowances, or the value of moving and storage services provided by the government to move you and your spouse and dependents to and from these separate locations. Then we have the tuition and fees deduction. Who can take the deduction? And again, most of the time, oftentimes, even if you have tuition and fees, you might not be taking the deduction due to the fact that you're first going to try to get the most benefit by taking the credit. So there's 2 credits that will typically be related to higher education for tuition and fees that you'll probably go for first because they're usually more beneficial. Then, if you can't get those, or if for some reason the deduction is more beneficial, you go for the deduction. So that's going to be the discussion if people ask about, I paid tuition and fees. Why isn't it on the deductions on Schedule 1? You're going to say, well, probably because it's going to be on credits that we'll be taking, and that'll be on page 2 of the 1040 and related schedules possibly, and we'll take a look at the credits in future presentations related to tuition and fees. So you may be able to take the deduction if you, your spouse, or dependent you claim as your tax return was a student enrolled at or attending an eligible educational institution. The deduction is based on the amount of qualified education expenses you paid for the student in the current year for academic periods beginning in the current year or beginning in the first 3 months of the following year. Generally, in order to claim the deduction for education expenses for a dependent, you must have paid the expenses in the current year and must claim the student as a dependent on your current year tax return. The dependent line on Form 1040 SR for additional information. You can take a look at publication 970. You can't claim the tuition and fees deduction if any of the following apply. Your filing status is married filing separately. So again, this is one of those areas where the IRS is skeptical. If you're married, then you can't typically go back to single or head of household unless you're divorced, or you're gonna be divorced at least for tax purposes. You have the choice between married filing separately. The IRS is very skeptical of married filing separately because they're skeptical of people taking advantage of deductions or credits, especially those that have like an income limitation or cap. So this is one of those examples. They're going to limit any deduction you may be able to take if you decide to file married filing separately instead of married. Another person can claim and accept an exemption for you as a dependent on his or her tax return. You can't take the deduction even if the other person doesn't actually claim the exemption. So if the exemption is kind of an old term here, but if someone else is claiming you basically as a dependent, then you can't take the deduction typically. Your modified adjusted gross income, MAGI, and remember, anytime we have these phase outs, we're typically thinking adjusted gross income, your income limit phase out. It's going to phase out based on your income. AGI, adjusted gross income, is typically the line item they're looking at, and it's modified, which is usually a fairly small, item compared to the AGI itself. And usually one of those items that will be modified in this case is going to be the actual deduction, usually, because this is a deduction for AGI. So you kind of, if you don't remove it, then you get that circle kind of reference when you're looking at the phase out. So basically an AGI or income limitation is more than $80,000 or $160,000 if married filing a joint return. You were a non-resident alien for any part of the year and didn't elect to be treated as a resident alien for tax purposes. For more information on non-resident aliens can be found on publication 519, U.S. Tax Guide for Aliens. You can't claim a tuition and fees deduction for any student if you or anyone else claims an American Opportunity or Lifetime Learning Credit, Form 8863. And that's probably what most people will do, is claim that credit if it's applicable, and therefore they will no longer be able to take the deduction because you can't take both. In the current year, for expenses for students for whom the qualified education expenses were paid. However, a state tax credit won't disqualify you from claiming a tuition and fees deduction. So if it's a state tax credit, then that will not be the disqualification. We're talking about these two credits being federal credits. Now, you might then get a form like this for the tuition that was paid, which would be a 1098-T type of form that could help you out to think about. So if you see this form in someone's tax preparation, Or if you know someone that their dependent is a student and you know that, or that they are going to school, and you might ask this as a general question: are you going to school, or any of the dependents going to school? And if they give you this, which they will typically give you if they're a tax client and they're giving you all your tax information, then your first thought isn't the deduction. Your first thought is, okay, maybe they can get the credits, the 2 credits involved, because those are typically more beneficial. And if not, then you're thinking about this particular deduction. If you got questions about any line item, then you can see the instructions. You can look up the instructions on the IRS website if they are not provided by looking up Form 1098-T on the IRS website. We'll discuss this form more when we get to the credits and the education credits in a future presentation.